is Andy, or as Aaron said, Mr. Clarke. But only if I'm older than you. It's probably not the case for a lot of this. I've just been out to Impact, which is our youth work for 5 to 11s. They're having a great morning. They send their greetings. At least I send greetings on behalf of them to you. It's good to remember them and just remember that we do have some kids in this church as well. They've just had a crazy time of games and worship. They're going into a time of teaching now. Emma and I were testing out some remote control racing cars last night on their behalf. I love my job. I really do. We're in a series called Faith Works. This is a series looking at the book of James. James is a letter written by, you guessed it, James in the New Testament. Simon gave a great introduction to this book last week. If you weren't around because this is your first time here, or if you're more of a regular, that's a regular, not irregular. Not that if you're a regular, why not go back and, if you weren't here for it, why not go back onto our website and listen to the audio file for that and catch up. It's a fantastic overview of who James was, why he was writing, who he was writing to, kind of some of the main themes that come out in the book of James. James is a book of themes in many ways. It's not a coherent kind of systematic linear thought. There's themes that come up here and there. So we're going to pick out some themes today as we go through the first section of James. And it may well be the case that in a few weeks' time, the same themes come out again. So don't be surprised if there's some particular ideas that have gone over a few times. It's great. It's a great way of learning, actually, to go through and to be reminded of these things. So I'm going to read the passage that we're looking at today. This is really the first kind of section of content from James. Before I do, let me just give a note on note-taking, as it were. An exercise, this might be helpful for you, it's helpful for me, that I like to do is when you're reading a passage, why not, if you've got a notebook or if you've got a phone that has the capacity to do this, why not write down the initial questions that come to mind, points of interest perhaps, things that you kind of think, that doesn't really make any sense, or things that do make sense to you. You kind of go, I love that James has said this. Why not write those down? And then at the end of today's service, if those questions or points of intrigue haven't been answered, why not ask someone about that? If you're a regular here, why not ask your small group leader or a member of the leadership team? If this is your first time and you have questions, why not ask someone that you've seen up the front today? It's a great way of picking up things that you perhaps wouldn't have remembered to go back and talk about. So we're in the book of James, and we are starting in chapter 1. Simon spent a good 45 minutes preaching through about 7 words last time. It's probably more like 100 words today, so no one's got any afternoon plans, have they? We'll try and... Oh, great puns just come to mind. Hey, that would be James and the Giant Preach. Come on. We're going to get rid of that logo. Can we get a peach up there? That's the new one. Anyway, back into holiness. James 1, verse 2 through to at the end of verse 11 is where we're reading from today. I'm going to read from the ESV, and the ESV words will appear on the screen behind me as well. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flowers fall, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. There's no warm-up with James, really. There's a small kind of 2-line greeting that Simon used as a way of kind of introducing us to the book last week. But there's no long greeting, something that's so common, particularly with books in the New Testament. If you're not familiar with the Bible, here's a 30-second crash course. Bible split up into 2 parts, Old Testament, New Testament. Testament, just a fancy name for covenant, really, kind of old way of doing things, new way of doing things. Old Testament, set of documents written before the time of Jesus. New Testament, set of documents written during the life of and after the life of Jesus. James is in the New Testament. The New Testament is made up largely of letters, early Christian leaders writing to fellow Christians. James is one of those. It's a letter. Now, just as we would today in a letter or an email, we might give a greeting, or at least I hope you would. Don't just send texts or emails like, da-da-da-da-da, straight into the point. If you do that, don't text me or email me. Greetings. We kind of, even if there's a hi there, there's some sort of greeting, isn't there? And it's the same with the New Testament letters. Sometimes they can be quite long. Paul has some lengthy greetings. He writes the majority of the letters in the New Testament. He's the second greatest contributor to the New Testament in terms of word count, second only to a guy called Luke, who wrote a gospel, that is an account of the life of Jesus, and an account of the early church we call the book of Acts. So there's no real greeting. There's a brief one, but he's straight to the point. He's straight to the jugular. Why is this? Maybe he's written to them recently. Maybe he's just a bit rude. I probably wouldn't get any emails from James. But he goes straight for it. He is going straight to the point. And I said he's going straight to the jugular. Let me explain that term. Here's a picture of my wife's cat. Don't awe it. It's useless. It's a useless cat. I've got a lady here who loves cats who's thinking, we're going to have words later. It's a useless cat. Let me explain why it's useless. I bought this cat with two intentions. One, I'm a loving husband, and my wife kept on slipping in some hints that she'd love a pet at some point, and Christmas was coming up. I should have stopped there. That's the only reason I bought this cat. There was perhaps another reason. I don't like insects, personally. I don't like catching them. I got married, and I was made well aware at the time that that would be one of my primary duties. I'm convinced there might be other reasons why my wife married me, but perhaps one of the main ones. I don't like insects. I had a genius idea. If I get a cat, all I need to do is put the cat by the insect, and the cat will eat the insect. It's worked brilliantly for 5 or 6 months or so, and then it got useless. It saw a spider, and it would kind of just, bat it around a bit. It would kind of just, you'd wake up in the morning and there'd be spider legs kind of spread across the kitchen floor, or you'd find a beetle kind of twitching like that. Not Paul McCartney or anyone, just like a little insect. I want a lion or a cheetah, a big cat. Have you ever watched those documentaries where you see a lion chasing down a gazelle or an antelope? The way they kill them, they don't just kind of do that to it. They get their jaws and they lock around the windpipe of the animal. They go straight for the jugular. That immobilizes it, takes it down, and then it starts feeding on it. James is a lion or a cheetah. He's a big cat. He goes straight for the jugular. Why? I reckon it's because he's got some great affection for these people. I think there's a correspondence going on between the two. Perhaps that's why there's such a short greeting. There's a kind of regularity in their talk, which also suggests that James has oversight of them. He has care for them. He addresses them as my brothers, or my brothers and sisters in some translations, which is fine because he's talking about a people group. It's inclusive. So James goes straight for it. He's not a politician. He's not afraid of giving a straight answer. He's no marketing strategist. He sells his product as it is. He goes straight in. Trials, testing of your faith, suffering, perhaps. He goes straight for it. I don't know about you, that prompts a question for me if we're on the next slide. Suffering and trials, James comes straight out with it. And I think this question could be asked even if you've been in the church for 1,000 years or if this is your first time in a church today. Good God, sufferings. Good God, trials. Good God, testing of your faith. Are they compatible? Has James just gone straight in with a big, big mistake? How does this work? More than that, how can James really expect us to find joy in it? He says, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you experience these things. Joy and good God in trials. I just want to mention a preaching series we did, I guess it was about this time last year, called BA for BQ, Big Answers for Big Questions, where we addressed some big questions that are often asked of the Christian faith. If there's a God, how about this? One of those was suffering. Simon preached on suffering. I'd encourage you, if you weren't around with us for that preaching series, go back, listen, because that was a whole preach that was dedicated to the issue of suffering. I haven't got all the time in the world today to do that, but we're going to go into it slightly. So if you are interested in that topic, go back and watch the video through the X1 website, or talk to me afterwards, perhaps. What does James have to say? Because we need an answer to this, don't we? So there's some sort of suffering. We need an answer to this. What does James say? It's only fair to go to James first because, well, it's his book, isn't it? Let's see what slide we're on. So James says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." So James is associating troubles with a test. When I say the word test, is that scary for you? Who enjoyed tests at school? I did. It worked. I've got short-term memory. I can't remember anything in the long term. But for a test, that's fine. So it's not much benefit to me now. But hey, driving test. Who found a driving test scary? Hands up if, like me, you didn't pass your driving test on the first go. We are a church of awful drivers, aren't we? We really are. No one's getting a lift back with anyone that's put their hand up today, are they? A test. How is a test supposed to leave us full of joy? It might not be a bad thing because we can come out of tests well. We can pass tests. I passed my driving test the second time around. Some of us are good at particular types of tests and some are not. And there are tests of many kinds. There's academic tests. There's practical tests like a driving test. Maybe there's even kind of pressure situations where you're cooking a meal for guests that are coming around and you need to get it right because otherwise no one's eating. Maybe some people do well in different types of tests than others. Ultimately, tests are an opportunity to prove yourself to God in this case. A test at school is a chance for you to show the school how much you've learned over the year. James is perhaps saying that a test is a chance for you to prove yourself. For the Christian, tests of suffering and trial aren't necessarily a bad thing because when a Christian's faith is tested, it can produce perseverance or steadfastness, as James says. So James seems to say there's something to do with a test here. Let's widen this up to the wider Bible, because it'd be wrong just to look at one book or one kind of verse to build up an entire theology about something. Let's go through to Romans 5, where Paul, who I mentioned earlier, he's writing to the people in Rome. He says this in Romans 5: "We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope." Do you see the similarities there? If we go on to the next slide again, we can see James and Paul side by side. You can see the similarities. One's saying joy, the other's saying rejoice. Sufferings, trials, testing of faith produces endurance or steadfastness, and that produces character, according to Paul. So there's two different authors making the same point. That adds a bit of reliability. Just on a point that Simon mentioned last week, throughout church history, people have often seen James and Paul as completely different entities. You can't have James and Paul together because Paul is saying, live by faith, and you don't need to really worry about what you do. And people have thought that James is saying, worry about what you do, and you don't need to worry about faith so much. Both come hand in hand and complement each other. Both are saying faith is great, you need faith in God. Both are saying your faith needs to be worked out in what you do. This is another example of where Paul and James complement each other, highlighting the intricacies and the union of the New Testament. Both of these people, both Paul and James, expect us to somehow act against suffering or act against trials. So how we deal with those, how we act, is going to be our next theme that we're going to bring out. But for me, there's still an elephant in the room. I love that phrase. Why is suffering around in the first place? So I want to encourage us, firstly, let's have the discussion. I mentioned Big Answers for Big Questions, which deals with some of these questions in full. Let's have the discussion. Let's not be afraid to have the discussion. Good God, suffering. Does it work? Secondly, If any set of ideas or people has any position to comment on whether there can be a good God and suffering together, it's the Christian faith, and let me tell you why. Jesus, in Matthew 16:24, says, "Take up your cross daily and follow me." Jesus is instructing his followers, take up your cross. That's not a nice thing. That's an instrument of death. He might as well say, take up your gas chamber or take up your bullets. He's saying, take up that thing that you might even suffer on and follow me. So not only does Jesus instruct his followers, and there's going to be some hard times, he himself ultimately goes through suffering. Jesus Christ, the man who was God incarnate, that means God enfleshed in earth, experiences suffering in a way that, to be honest, I don't think any of us in this room have, or I pray ever will. The man who said he was God was brutally murdered in the most painful way that the Romans knew how. The gospel writer Mark records it like this. They clothed him in a purple cloak and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him. And they led him out to crucify him. Crucify is a horrendous form of execution. It suffocates you in the end, as well as being beaten and being nailed to a cross. It suffocates you in the end. It's a drawn-out process. God is not unaware of suffering. Let's not go into this issue thinking that this is some great claim we have against God. Well, if you're all good, how is there suffering? No. Jesus Christ experienced physical and emotional pain in the same way that we do, and if not a lot more. Don't think it's impossible for both God to be good and suffering to exist. Jesus Christ holds both together in one moment on the cross. God, suffering. This cuts across any concept of a prosperity gospel. For those of you who are unaware of that, prosperity gospel is an understanding of the Christian faith that says, trust Jesus and nothing bad will really happen to you. You'll get all the money you want. You won't go through that pain. This cuts right across that because actually Jesus is saying to his followers, take up your cross. That's not prosperous necessarily, in the immediate anyway. Jesus himself experiences suffering. Now a word on joy. Joy in suffering or joy in trials. Joy isn't the same as happiness. Let's make sure we're aware of that. Pharrell Williams can keep his happiness as far as I'm concerned because happiness has to do with circumstances and situations. It changes. I was happy and joyful when I saw this. I was unhappy, but still joyful when an hour later I saw this. As long as you have joy to go with that happiness, I don't mind. I kept my joy, the situation changed. It didn't stop me being joyful. I was unhappy. Joy in suffering, doesn't that seem a bit stupid maybe? Joy in suffering, come on, really? Here's how Jesus had his joy in suffering. Hebrews 12:2 says this, "For the joy set before him, Christ endured the cross." Christ was suffering. It was a bad circumstance. He was probably unhappy. He didn't lose his joy because he knew of what was set before him. Eternal life, glory. He was probably unhappy, but joy came through. Jesus is the best example of joy in suffering. We're able to do it. How do we do that? We move on to the theme of perseverance. This is something that James brings up again later in the book. The question that follows for James, after the idea of your faith being tested, is how you deal with those trials. Here's what he writes. "You know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Perseverance, steadfastness in the ESV. How do you come out of a test that you failed at or you've flunked? For me, in my driving test, I tried again. I persevered. I dropped my pen. I persevered. I got there. James says the appropriate response to trials is perseverance. It's not giving up, it's perseverance. Does Paul agree? Yes. He uses the word endurance. Steadfast, persevere, endurance. Why? Why bother persevering? Why not just give in to it, go with it? Why not give in to the suffering? It's formative. Enduring through suffering forms you as a person. Paul and James agree. Look at this. James says, let perseverance finish its work. It's doing something. It's doing a work in us when we persevere through suffering. James says it's making you mature and complete. For Paul, he says endurance produces character. It builds us. Character in turn builds hope, says Paul. And so both these guys, these New Testament writers, are agreeing. They're saying it's doing something in you. When you persevere, when you stand strong through trials, it builds something in you. It changes you. So what's the good thing about growing in character, or being complete, as James says, being mature, lacking nothing? Well, ultimately, it makes you godly. You're godly if you persevere, if you are mature, if a work is being done in you and you're being built up, you're becoming more like Jesus. You're becoming more godly. It's not a difficult concept, really, is it? If you want to be a good drummer, you have to practice drumming. You have to kind of go through that initial tension time, perhaps, of not being good at something, and then as time goes by, you become good at it. Same with driving a car. You're not going to know how to drive a car unless you get into it, unless you actually learn how to do it, unless you put yourself through the struggles of not knowing how to do something and then do it. If you want to be better than you are today in whatever way, let's talk about that in terms of godliness. If you want to be more godly than you are today, if you want to be more like Jesus who endured trials, persevere and let that build your character, because that is what Jesus did. James' expectations are high. He says, be steadfast, persevere, so that you can be perfect. Not so you can be all right, not so you can be 6 out of 10, so you can be perfect. Who is perfect? Sunday school answer. Jesus. Very good. The voices to go with it. Be strong and persevere and endure so you can be more like Jesus, who endured suffering for the joy set before him. Now, experiencing pain doesn't mean you definitely will be joyful. Going through suffering and trial doesn't mean that, great, joy is going to come. It gives you the opportunity to be joyful. There's no set formula. There's no case of, oh, great, I'm a Christian, suffering will come and it's all going to be fine. We can fail at that. We can fail at persevering through trials. But James calls us not to. He calls us to persevere. The burden's on us to take the opportunity to persevere. Suffering is a chance to prove ourselves in the test that James points out. How do we persevere? James moves on to say we persevere through wisdom. That's how we do it. That's how we are able to keep going. This is an Old Testament concept. James is at it again. He loves doing this. He's almost like an Old Testament writer in some ways. That might have been a quote from Simon there. Credit to him if that was. If not, he's like an Old Testament writer. He brings about these concepts. When he's talking about suffering later on in the book, as we'll come to later in the series, he talks about the Old Testament prophets. He highlights them. He uses Abraham as an example at one point. He loves going through this Old Testament imagery, more of which is yet to come in this passage today. So wisdom is a really Old Testament concept in many ways. There's a set of books in the Old Testament called the wisdom literature. There's 5 of them: Job, Psalms, Proverb, Song of Songs or Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. We're going to be going into a preaching series later in the year. So wisdom is a massive thing for James. Missed out Job. Wisdom literature. Wisdom is a massive thing. The highlight of the wisdom literature is the book of Proverbs. It's the ultimate book of wisdom, as it were. Proverbs brilliantly portrays wisdom as a desirable lady. Here's Proverbs 8. Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice on the heights beside the way? At the crossroads, she takes her stand beside the gates in front of the town. At the entrance of the portals, sounds very Halo, she cries aloud, to you, O men, I call, and my cry is the children of man. O simple ones, learn prudence. Simple ones, there's a phrase we need to bring back. O fools, learn sense. Hear, for I will speak noble things, and from my lips will come what is right. Do you see that personification of wisdom? From my lips will come what is right. For my mouth will utter truth. Wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the words of my mouth are righteous. There is nothing twisted or crooked in them. They are all straight to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her. Lady Wisdom, as shown in Proverbs. A lot of Old Testament commentators see wisdom as Jesus. Jesus is the personification of wisdom. We read this in Proverbs 2. The Lord possessed me. This is wisdom talking. The Lord possessed me, wisdom, at the beginning of his work. The first of his acts of old. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. There's this idea that wisdom is a way of living. God set up the world with wisdom in it. There's a way to do things. We see wisdom in Jesus, in the way that he lives and the way that he instructs people. We lose that wisdom when we fall away from God in the beginning. We turn to ourselves. We look at sin and selfishness instead of putting God first. And so wisdom is lost, something that is to be attained through knowing God. James says we should ask for wisdom and we'll receive it. This is the way that he says we persevere through trials. We ask for wisdom. And this is the most brilliant and simple piece of application ever. Are you suffering at the moment? Are you going through a trial? Have you been recently? Will you in the future? Probably yes. Are you asking God for wisdom? Are we asking God for wisdom in those things? How do we ask God for wisdom? We pray. We interact with him. We talk to him. We read his scriptures. We are part of a church looking to seek God together. We seek wisdom together. If you are going through a trial and you're not asking for wisdom, how are you going to persevere? How is your character going to be built? Seek wisdom from the Lord. If you're not someone who would describe yourselves as of the Christian faith today, are you going through a trial? Have you been through a trial? Are you going to go through a trial? Probably yes. Why not try asking God for wisdom? James paints out that it's a pretty good thing to do. Ask God for wisdom through your trials. With the wisdom God grants, we can persevere and see character and godliness grow. It's a great image that James uses to kind of describe this idea of one who doesn't have wisdom, one who's not seeking God, one who just kind of lets the trials and the circumstances dictate what they do. He uses the image of a storm. He uses the idea of these strong winds blowing the water, blowing the waves around. The waves have no control. They're kind of subjected to what the wind wants them to do. There's a proverb that is quite similar to this. Proverbs 2, hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a garland for your head and pendants for your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without reason. This is kind of a story of a young man being brought up in peer pressure to act in a certain way. And wisdom is saying, don't do that. Don't be subject to your circumstances, particularly if they're bad circumstances. Bad peer pressure, example, listen up to that. Might be particularly relevant to you. Peer pressure or trials that kind of can drive you, like James says, like the wind blows the sea. Take control of it. Don't let your trials dictate how you respond. Ask for wisdom in order that you can take control to persevere, in order that you can let God take control, I should say. A few notes on wisdom for us. If one can be qualified to give notes on wisdom. We can ask God for wisdom to help us, is essentially what James is saying. But another way of gaining wisdom is through experience, through experiencing the trials and persevering through them. Persevere through trials, you'll have wisdom to give to others. It's so true that we see wisdom as something that often comes with age. They say grey hair is a crown of splendor, gained through living a wise life or a righteous life. At least that's what I tell myself whenever I see a few grey hairs coming through in my beard at 22 years of age. No, don't feel bad for me, I'm wise. Wisdom can come with age and can come with experience of the trials. Those who persevere through trials are wise people. You know, we live in a culture that has plenty of information in it. I got a new tablet recently, and I can't think how many apps there are where you can get information through to you. If it's not a social media feed or a news feed, sport feed, it came up with this section for baking ideas on my home screen. It's just information just bombarding us. We see it everywhere. TV, advertising, information. There's so much information, but there's not enough wisdom. We don't want information. Wisdom isn't the same as knowledge. It's knowing how to apply that knowledge. It's knowing what knowledge to lay aside. That's what wisdom is. And faith is not the opposite of wisdom. We can so often kind of polarize these. You've got faith, we live by faith. And wisdom's over here, perhaps. Living by faith doesn't necessarily mean you live in a risky manner. Because James is saying it's faith that builds up wisdom. Have the faith to ask God for wisdom. Faith and wisdom come closely together. I did say necessarily in there. That doesn't mean that there are times when we can live by this kind of stereotypical, I'm living by faith, I'm not worrying about tomorrow. There might be times where that is appropriate and correct, but let's not disregard wisdom as well, says James. So let me summarize some of the stuff we've looked at before we draw this to a close today. I'm aware that we need to finish on time so that our kids are done at 12 as well as we are. We've seen that suffering is just part of life. It happens. We all experience it. But so too did Jesus Christ as he was dying for our sins. We've seen that Christ calls us to find joy through perseverance in hard times, just as Christ did as he looked forward to eternal life. And we've seen that we can persevere through asking for wisdom from God, who set forth Christ as the very embodiment of wisdom. He doesn't mention Jesus very often, but my goodness, James knows the gospel of Christ. Here's the greatest warning, though. It comes from James, not from me. James talks about the rich and the poor. This is where he's almost like a very Old Testament writer. He brings up this kind of sociology where actually, if you were rich, you probably were evil. We can't necessarily talk in those terms because, quite frankly, all have fallen short of the glory of God. All have the potential for sin and all have the potential for salvation. James says this, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flowers fall and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. There's a brilliant metaphor that can come out of here from the rich man. A rich man is a proud man. He loves money and possessions more than God. He's stubborn. A poor man is humble like his surroundings. He has nothing to hold on to, so he's no problem letting go of everything to seek help. But do you know how to catch a monkey? Tangent, perhaps. You know how to catch a monkey? Peanuts in a jar. Fantastic. So here's how you catch a monkey. If you don't have a jar, you can use a coconut or whatever tropical fruit might be handy for you. You do is you put some nuts in a jar or in a coconut or something like that with a hole just small enough so imagine that's a monkey hand, can just kind of fit through it like that. They then grab the nuts and then they try and bring them back again. But to hold onto the nuts, they've got their fists clenched and they can't pull it back through the hole, which is too small. And so they're kind of caught in this decision. Do I free my hand by letting go of the food? Or do I just keep trying? Monkeys are stupid. Honestly, my cat looks sensible in comparison to a monkey. Husbands, I've had that look. Monkeys are stupid. They don't know what to do. Shall I let go of what I really want? They just don't know. This is the metaphor of the rich man. Do I give it up? Do I give up my pride? Do I put myself in a position where I'm willing to humble myself and ask for wisdom? That I'm willing to pull out and kind of go, I'm struggling here. There's a trial. There's some suffering. I don't know what to do. I can't do it by myself. Here's James' warning. Don't be too late in letting go of that thing. It came up a few times in worship today, this idea of what's first and a half, that additional thing. What are we not quite willing to let go of in order to let God fill us with wisdom, for God to help us to persevere? And there's a time scale on it. That section in James reads like this: like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. That is the proud man. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flowers fall and its beauty perishes. You know, in the Middle East, the sun gets scorchingly hot. For more information on that, see any recent news article about the World Cup, the Qatar World Cup, that can't be played in summer because it's going to be too hot. And in that, the wind gets hot as well. And it can this kind of boiling wind can blow over. It can be, you can have fresh green grass that is looking healthy in one moment, and then minutes later, the wind comes in and it's suddenly yellow. We don't see anything like that in our country. It's one of those things that we probably have to see to believe. Again, James goes back to the Old Testament. This is resonating with Psalm 103. As for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field, for the wind passes over it, and it is gone, and its place knows it no more. It's pride that doesn't allow us to ask for wisdom in our sufferings. It's those things that mean we will be like the flower that's stuck in the hot wind, that will be known no more by the world if we cannot find God and build godliness through persevering in trials. Don't let pride stop you from asking God for wisdom. Mark 8:36 says this. This is perhaps written for monkeys trying to get food from a jar. What good is it to gain the whole world but lose your soul? Let's not gain stuff or reputation, those things that can so often build up our pride. Instead, let's find wisdom, whatever it takes, because it builds godliness. So we've seen suffering or trials, we've seen joy, we've seen perseverance, and we've seen wisdom. Let's hold that all together. I'm going to pray for us. I'm going to ask us to stand onto this. If any of this is sitting particularly with you and you've got questions to ask or you want to engage on something that I've brought up here today, I'll be at the connection zone at the end. If you go down the corridor the way we came in and turn left, we're going to have teas and coffees in that area there. And that's a place, the connection zone, you'll see a TV screen. That's a place where I'll be there and some other leaders of the church where you can ask your questions. We can engage on these issues. I would love to do that with you.